Before we get into the debate, I want to introduce our debaters a little bit. We have two teams here who are varsity teams from Minnesota. We're really glad they're here. Normally we would clap for them, but we don't have an audience that can do that. So if you're in the chat, post, hey, thanks debaters for debating for us. Our two teams are from Central High School and Farmington High School, representing St. Paul and Farmington, respectively. So thank you, debaters, for being here. We really appreciate it. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, saying who you are and what school you're from before you start your first speech. You don't have to do it right now. The last note before we get into this is I ask that all debaters try to follow along in this round and follow along with the arguments. Because in policy debate, we're really focused on the evidence and the arguments and not so much on like the presentation and speaking really prettily, right? And in fact, you can say a word like prettily in policy debate, which is not a real word, and the judges won't really care. They're more focused on the content of what you're saying and not how, you know, beautiful and eloquent you're saying it. So to that end, I'd like you all to take a piece of paper. Well, of course, you can't see it with my background now. Have it the long way, like this, and fold it once over the center. So it's folded in half. And then fold it again over the center. And then one more time. Guess what we're going to do? We're going to fold it over the center. So in the end, you should have this long strip of paper. It's probably about an inch wide, something like that. And when you unfold your piece of paper, what you'll get is 8 columns. These 8 columns are really nice because in debate, there are 8 speeches. So you can have a piece of paper like this to track what's said in every single speech. And that way, at the end of the debate, you can look back and see which arguments were made, which arguments were answered, which ones weren't answered, and where the debate is going generally. So you should have 2 pieces of paper, so you should do this twice. So I'll do it again. I'll show you again, just in case some of you came a little bit late. Take a piece of paper, have it long ways like this, fold it in half across the center once, get a nice crease in there. I'm not super good at origami, but this is pretty easy. And then take that sheet of paper, fold it across the center again, and then do that same fold across the center one last time. And now you have 2 pieces of paper with 8 columns each, and you're going to be ready to follow the debate. So I suggest you start in the far left column of your piece of paper. And as we do the first speech, just write everything you think is relevant, write it all the way down in that column. And if you fill up the whole column, just flip your sheet over and use the backside, use the exact same column. Okay, that's probably enough from me. You will find people in debate do speak a little bit here. And we should probably get into the debate. So our first debater is either going to be Caden or Marin. Going to be one of those two. It's not going to be anyone named Karen. I can guarantee you that. And the first speech in the debate is 8 minutes long, although I sincerely doubt that they will take up that whole time. So Central, I'm going to turn it over to you. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll get into the first speech, which will be entirely about the affirmative's case for what policy should be passed and the reasons why that policy is a good idea.
Okay, welcome to the debate, judges. My name is Caden, and I use they, them pronouns, and this is my partner, Marin, who uses she, her pronouns. And we will be representing the affirmative side. Today, we will be defending the following plan. The United States federal government should increase its protections of water resources in the United States by 1, limiting agricultural exemptions to the Clean Water Act, 2, conditioning federal agricultural subsidies on water protection, and 3, requiring the disclosure of agrochemical use. Funding and enforcement are through normal means. Our first advantage is runoff. A, uniqueness. Agricultural runoff is hurting water quality now, threatening our society. Smith et al., an analysis at Economic Research Service 2019. 55% of rivers, 71% of lakes, and 84% of bays had impaired water quality. The nation's water is an important resource that is necessary for survival. Agriculture is one of the largest sources of pollutants. The largest causes of impairments are sediments, nutrients, and pathogens. While these can come from other sources, agriculture is the largest source. Next, B, internal link. Dead zones destroy ecosystems and biodiversity, both inland and in the ocean. Boehm, an economist at Union of Concerned Scientists 20. The nitrogen that contributes to the dead zone between 60 and 80% originates on farms. Excess nitrogen in rivers can cause algae overgrowth and deplete the oxygen available to healthy marine life, creating vast dead zones. Straightforward solutions are needed. Reducing nitrogen losses from farms is such a solution that could head off serious damage to Gulf ecosystems. Gulf fisheries are the foundation for fishing and coastal industries. Next, C, internal link. Pesticides are a major threat to biodiversity, studies prove. Steele and Scholes, who are researchers at the Institute of Environmental Sciences, 15. Agricultural systems are drivers of global environmental degradation. Insecticides are highly biologically active substances that can threaten the ecological integrity of ecosystems. Surface water pollution resulting from current agricultural insecticide use constitutes an excessive threat to aquatic biodiversity. Next, D, impact. Biodiversity loss risks our destruction. We confront invisible thresholds. Schultz, who has a PhD and wrote this at Harvard, 2016. Life forms are too old, too complex, and potentially too useful to be carelessly discarded. Life is interdependent. Ecosystems cannot be recreated. We don't know what's important for our survival, and we don't know what we can remove without potentially disastrous consequences for us. Not only can't we tell what parts of the biosphere will be useful to us, we could easily produce our own extinction by eliminating parts of the ecosystem essential for us. Next, E, solvency. The plan causes a shift towards sustainable agriculture without pesticides and fertilizer. The combination of regulation, subsidy changes, and transparency will work. Bregan and Myers, who are researchers at the Environmental Law Institute, 2014. To reduce pollution, operations that accept federal subsidy payments should assume responsibility for implementing a baseline set of stewardship practices designed to minimize pollution. We recommended crop operations publicly report on fertilizers. Disclosure would increase public access to information while helping to discourage practices that result in overuse. Reductions occur in response to perceived public or market pressures. Next, F, solvency. The plan encourages agriculture innovation. This decreases pollution and benefits the industry. Finney, Clerk, U.S. District Court, 2021. Regulation improves competitiveness. Environmental regulation can spur firms to increase efficiency of production, as well as quality of products. Early regulation that spurs compliance innovation can provide the industry with a first mover advantage, capturing market share. Agricultural exceptionalism hinders organic agriculture from competing. Regulators would force conventional agriculture to incorporate its true costs. This would decrease the price disparity between conventional and organic agriculture and increase price competition. There would likely be an increase in technological competition involving innovations that reduce water pollution. That is the end of my 1AC.
Excellent. Thank you, Caden. So before we go into an explanation of what Caden just read, the arguments there, we want to have some time for what's called cross-examination. So the team who just read their arguments, just said their arguments, is going to have some questions asked of them by the opposing team. So generally the person who just read their speech, they're the person who's going to be answering the questions from the other team. So Farmington, would you like to have 3 minutes of cross-examination here?
Yes. And just to introduce myself quick, I'm Riley. I'm doing cross-examination for the 1AC, and I'll also be speaking later on in the debate. Yeah. So my first question is, in your Steele-Schultz 15 card, you talk about how pesticides are a threat to biodiversity. How does the affirmative plan solve for the issue of pesticides?
Yeah, so basically, as it states in our plan, we are limiting agriculture exemptions to the Clean Water Act and requiring the disclosure of agrochemical use. So the first point in our plan is going to be limiting these exemptions, which can include some pesticides, which will then lead to damaging of biodiversity. The other thing is that requiring the disclosure of agrochemical use, which is the third point in our plan, directly relates to our Brigham and Myers 14 card, which explains how transparency helps lead to competition, which will decrease the amount of pesticides that cause harm to our biodiversity.
Okay. And then you also talk about dead zones in your internal link card. How long will it take for the whole ecosystem to turn into a dead zone?
So I'm not sure exactly that the card is explaining that the whole environment will turn to a dead zone, because the dead zones are specifically in reference to the algae systems, but I think it's explaining that very quickly the effects of these algae dead zones will lead to mass biodiversity losses, which I guess you could label as a dead zone, which will then lead to the extinction impact that's listed later.
Okay. And then what innovation are you talking about in your FINI 21 solvency evidence?
So it's talking about agricultural innovation. So that could be different ways of farming that, reduce the amount of pesticides needed to get the same amount of crops, like how organic farming is currently done. And later it also talks about how incorporating its true cost. So as we know, damaging the environment is a massive cost. So the plan would force non-organic agriculture to take responsibility for these costs in the way that they are farming, which would then lead to less pesticides use and other technological innovations.
Okay. And that's all I got.
Okay.
Nice. So the next speech is called the first negative constructive, or 1NC. Farmington will give that speech since Central gave the affirmative speech. Before we get there, let's just take a pause quick and recap what Caden said in their speech. So I'm not sure if you caught it right away, but Caden read their plan, the policy they want to make, at the beginning of the debate. And basically they said, we need more regulations on agriculture, because agriculture creates a lot of pollutants that get into the water. And the reason that Caden gave, from a very large overview, the reason Caden gave for doing that is because when those agricultural pollutants get into the water through runoff, it destroys the ecosystem, destroys biodiversity, creates dead zones, and creates all these really bad environmental problems, right? And then the end point of that is not just that, it's bad to have a bad environment, or it's bad when we lose species. It actually ends in what we call a terminal impact, something that happens at the end of this story to say why it's a really bad thing. So the impact that Caden was talking about was, if we lose some ecosystems, if we lose biodiversity, we don't know what type of impact, what ripple that will have out on the entirety of our ecosystem. And it could cause whole ecosystems to collapse and potentially have the world ecosystem collapse, which obviously if that happens, we as humans are in a lot of trouble too, right? So the whole argument here for the affirmative is, we have this really bad environmental problem going on, and it could result in these really terrible impacts. So what we should do is we should stop that process by creating some regulations that will stop runoff. So this is what, when I was taking notes, this is what my sheet looks like. So I have my 8 columns. This first column was filled in with some of the notes I made through the debate. I assume at this point, you're realizing you can't write down every single word in the debate, and that's fine. You don't need to. You just need to write the main ideas. So that recap I just gave about what the policy is, what the problem is, and how the policy solves that problem. If you have those three elements in any sense, you're doing a great job. So you don't have to be perfect right away. This is just the first debate. Just keep doing your best, try to take notes, and try to follow along with where we're at in the debate. So in this next speech, in the negative speech, they're going to respond to the affirmative arguments, and they're also going to bring up a new argument called the economy disadvantage. So you want to have both sheets of paper, and you want to make sure when they talk about the economy disadvantage, you write that on a new sheet of paper. And when they go respond to the affirmatives arguments, you go back to the other sheet of paper and you write where they're responding to the affirmatives arguments. If you don't get it exactly correct, that's okay. It's no big deal. It's not going to ruin the debate for you, but try your best. And I know Farmington is going to give a really good job telling you when you should be moving between sheets and what arguments they're going to be answering. So should be pretty easy. Okay, Farmington. We have 8 minutes for the 1 and C. Again, I don't think they'll take that long here, but Farmington should be Elena, right?
Hello, hello judges. My name is Elena, and this is my partner Riley, and we will be representing the negative side. We have 2 main arguments. First, that passing the plan will have an unintended consequences of ruining the economy, and second, that the plan will not solve the problem it outlines. We will start with our first argument, the economy disadvantage. First, on the economy disadvantage, uniqueness. The agriculture sector of the economy is strong now. That's Kaufman and Creighton 21. Alongside a sharp turnaround in agriculture, economic conditions, and lasting support from government programs, farming income and loan repayments rates both increased from a year ago. At the fastest pace on record, the improvement in farm finances and eased credit issues. The outlook for profit opportunities in 2021 remains strong for most agricultural producers, as commonly prices remained well above recent years. Next, link. Nonprofit source water regulations such as affirmative plan will tank the agriculture sector. That's Yeager and Hart 18. As the federal government authority and regulate nonprofit sources will result in permanent blurring of the essential line, which separates point and non-point sources, creating duplicate regulation. The stress of federal regulatory pressures will push our farm economy over a tipping point that will drive landowners away from food production. Next, C, internal link. Any harms to the agriculture sector ripple out to the rest of the economy, tanking the overall economy. Over 10% of all Americans directly depend on the agricultural economy for their job. That's Shriven 21. The pivotal roles played by the agriculture industries as employers, taxpayers, and providers of the food required to power the economy were the subjects of an illuminating new study. Agriculture directly employ 19.3 million Americans. Direct employment was equivalent to 12.9% of all U.S. employment. The value added to the economy was $2.7 trillion annually. The study indicated that livelihoods of 40.7 million Americans were directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture. Next, D, impact. Economic decline risks war, Liu 18. In the current landscape, a prolonged economic crisis could well escalate into a major global military conflict. Prolonged periods of economic distress have been characterized by antipathy towards minority groups and foreign countries, attitudes that can fuel unrest, terrorism, or even war. For example, during the Great Depression, the U.S. Herbert Hoover signed the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, intended to protect American workers and farmers from foreign competition. In the subsequent 5 years, global trade shrank by 2/3. Within a decade, World War II had begun. This is worrying in view of the factors stoking unrest and tension, including technological dispute, migration, political polarization, and nationalism. The next economic crisis could lead to a large-scale military confirmation. Next, I will be going on to case. So going on to case arguments laid out by the 1AC, we have two responses. First is A, no solvency. There are too many causes of nutrient pollution that the plan cannot solve. Johnson 15. Ethopraction has multiple causes. Increased prevalence of sewage, filters, and other chemicals for industry, household life are important contributors, but they are not the only way that people cause nutrient levels to rise. By cutting down trees, paving roads and parking lots, and developing in wetlands, nutrients are less likely to be taken up by plant roots and soil microbes or filtered through the groundwater. Next, B, no solvency. It is nearly impossible to determine who is doing what pollution, which means the plan cannot be enforced and farmers will not care. Sharma 20. To grain farmers' compliance, effective enforcement is necessary and involves the probability of getting caught. Diffuse sources of pollution are difficult to measure and regulate because they derive from activities disputed over wide areas of land and are variable in time due to effects of weather. Attributing causes liberally for these sources of pollution is therefore incredibly difficult. As the causes cannot be conflicted with other sources of pollution, penalties therefore do not act as an effective deterrent, as farmers are unlikely to be caught. And that is the end of the 1NC. I'm open for cross-ex.
Nice. So again, in the constructive, one team reads their arguments and then the other team is going to ask them some questions. So Central, whenever you're ready, we have 3 minutes for cross-examination.
Okay, so firstly, in your Jaeger and Hart 18 card, you stated that the plan leads to duplicative regulation or like two forms of regulation over the same thing. Can you explain why that's a bad thing?
Yeah, well, as the tag says, it will tank the agricultural sector, and it also pushes the farm economy to tip over and goes against the Clean Water Act.
Okay, could you just like explain the link chain between duplicative regulation and that kind of like push over the economic tipping point a little bit more?
Yeah. It says that in the card, it states that it blurs the essential line and that it drives like landowners from food production and it pressures them to push over the economy.
Okay, thank you. So second, in your SFERN 21 card, you stated that 10% of Americans directly rely on agriculture. Could you explain what degree an American needs to rely on agriculture in order to be labeled as directly reliant?
Yeah, our card states more about what you have to do for jobs. It states how 19.3 Americans that are directly employed rely on agriculture, which is 12.9% of the working class.
So they have to be like employed on a farm, basically?
No, you don't need to be employed on a farm. There's other jobs that are reliant on agriculture.
Okay, what other jobs?
It doesn't say specifically in the card, but like even if you work at a grocery store, you still need like eggs and like produce and stuff like that from agriculture. And manufacturing still needs stuff from agriculture.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the economy disadvantage, could you give a modern example of a recession in the United States being the main cause of a war?
Yeah, our blue 18 card talks about the Great Depression and the Tariff Act and how it intended to protect American workers. But shortly after that, World War II began. Also, you can look at like 9/11 and the effects caused on the War of Terror.
Okay, so would you say that that tariff act was the main cause of World War II? Okay, that's time.
Good question, but sometimes that happens in debate. You're just rolling, you got these great questions, and then time runs out. So another important note is in your debates, make sure to time yourselves. Okay, so that was the first negative constructive plus a cross-examination of the first negative constructive. So since the negative just spoke, now we have the second affirmative constructive. So the second affirmative constructive is going to respond to some of the negatives arguments that they just made, as well as going back to the arguments they already made and trying to show why they're still right about them. So both teams have good arguments at this point in the debate. They've laid out their main arguments, and these next two set of speeches are going to be sort of about looking at the evidence, looking at the main claims of each team, and seeing whose ideas and whose arguments are stronger. So, Marin, whenever you're ready, go ahead, take it away.
Cool. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. As the affirmative, we will start by defending our plan and then move to the negative's economy disadvantage. First, on the affirmative case, the negative did not answer our uniqueness, internal link, or impact arguments. Because they have no response, you should give us full weight on these when you determine whether the plan is a good idea or not. I will quickly recap each of these arguments. 1, uniqueness. R. Smith 2019 evidence says that water is badly polluted right now. Not only is agriculture the #1 cause of these problems, but 55% of rivers, 71% of lakes, and 84% of bays are totally polluted right now. Next, 2, internal link. Our Boehm 2020 and Steele and Schultz 2015 provide substantial studies and examples of how this pollution is causing huge losses of biodiversity and is completely destroying aquatic ecosystems. This situation is putting us in a situation where we may completely destroy ecosystems and biodiversity in the near future. Next, 3, impact. Finally, our Schultz 2016 evidence indicates that the loss of biodiversity could have far-reaching impacts. We do not know which species are keynote species or how much pollution the environment can handle. All life is interconnected, and at some point, if ecosystems collapse, it could lead to a domino effect resulting in a completely destroyed biosphere, including humans and most other animals. We're playing with fire, and it's only a matter of time before we get burned if we don't solve this problem. All right, moving on to solvency. 1, extend our Bregan-Myers 2014 evidence and our Finney 2021 evidence. The negative did not directly contest these arguments. They say that changing regulations and subsidies for agriculture will make farmers and companies change their practices and stop using pesticides and fertilizer. This, in turn, will greatly reduce the amount of pollution and dead zones which are causing the biodiversity crisis outlined in our 1AC. Next, 2, the first piece of evidence, the Johnson 15 evidence, simply says that there are other sources of pollution. Given that our uniqueness and internal link evidence say that the overwhelming majority of pollution is caused by agriculture, you can discard this evidence. It does not answer the data we have already provided. Next, 3, their second piece of evidence, the Sharma 2020 evidence, says that it is too difficult to enforce non-point source pollution regulations. A, there's no way to know this without passing the regulation first, and B, the plan uses not only regulations, but also subsidies to help keep farmers compliant. Farmers stand to lose much more than they gain by breaking the law under the affirmative plan. Next, 4, the plan solves combining regulations and incentives is the most effective. This completely answers the Sharma evidence 20. Matteo Sagasta et al., researcher, International Water Management Institute, 2017. Recent analysis suggests that a combination of approaches, regulations, economic incentives, and information works better than regulations alone. Policies to change farmer behavior and incentivize the adoption of good practices are key to preventing pollution. Benchmarking can promote behavioral changes among farmers by showing them how they perform compared with their peers. Regulations to protect water quality need to be enforceable. Moving on to the negatives economy disadvantage. 1, no impact. Historically, economic downturns are unlikely to cause war. Walt, International Relations Professor at Harvard, 2020. What about the relationship between economic conditions and war? Diversionary war strikes me as unlikely, even if one ignores the logical and empirical flaws in the theory itself. If depressions were a cause of war, there would be a lot more. The United States has suffered 40 recessions, yet has fought 20 wars, most of them unrelated to the state of the economy. States do not start wars unless they believe they will win a quick victory. National leaders avoid war when they are convinced it will be long, bloody, costly, and uncertain. Most important, the primary motivation for most wars is the desire for security, not economic gain. Next, 2, non-unique. Economic decline has been happening for 2 years because of COVID. Tapped reporter CNN 2021. America's economy isn't back to normal, and the recovery depends on consumers. Delta variant is posing a threat. The pace of the recovery has been moderating. The road to recovery has become more challenging. The renewed rise in infections has put the momentum in jeopardy. Urging people to wear masks could be a drag on the pace of improvements going forward. Next, 3, non-unique. The economy is trending negative right now. Unland, Financial Journalist, 21. More signs of a summer swoon for economic growth. Challenges were emerging for the health of the economic expansion, mostly due to COVID. 2 Wall Street firms had either cut or cautioned on their economic growth forecasts. Greater consumer caution weakened demand and mobility. Employment soured, production retrenched, and the health tracker fell on surging Delta variant contagion. That is the end of my speech. Open for cross-checks.
There we go. Farmington, whenever you're ready, we have 3 minutes of cross-examination here.
Okay. Okay, so my first question is that you said on solvency that the AF plan will greatly reduce the amount of pollution. Do you have the percentage of the decrease of pollution?
I don't think we have the percentage of decrease, but we have the percentage of where it's at right now, which is very scary percentages considering we're dealing with pollution in water.
Okay. What does the world look like in the eyes of your plan?
The world looks like less pesticides being leached into waters and a more regulated use of them and where they are being used.
Okay, and what economic incentives do you give to farmers?
So this could be conditioning federal agriculture subsidies on water protection. This is in our plan. This is the second point.
Okay. What are the negative effects that the plan has?
I don't believe there are any, or at least not any that our own evidence provides. We are trying to push the best plan that we can.
Okay. And is the plan saying that you solve for all pollution?
No, we are purely trying to address water pollution in lakes, streams, rivers, that sort of thing.
Okay. So are you solving for all water pollution, I guess I should have asked?
Because all water is connected, we are trying to solve for the pollution in waters.
Okay. Okay. That's all the questions that I have.
Cool. Thank you, Farmington. So next will be the second negative constructive. So Lauren just did the second affirmative constructive. She went back to her team's main arguments and said, okay, they answered these ones, but here's why they're wrong. And they didn't answer our arguments that said this, this, and this. So you should believe them. That's why they're right. And again, in policy debate, we always want to focus on the evidence and the arguments. So it's a really big deal if somebody doesn't answer some of your arguments, right? And then Martin also went to the negatives, new arguments about the economy and did her job to try to answer those also, right? So here in the second negative constructive, Farmington is going to answer some of those affirmative arguments and also go back to some of their own negative arguments and talk about those a little bit and talk about why maybe the affirmative didn't answer them enough or their evidence wasn't enough to answer them, and basically why they're still right about their points. So Farmington, whenever you're ready, you have 8 minutes for the second negative constructive. Go ahead and take it away.
All right. In our second negative speech, I will be defending our economy disadvantage and showing why passing the plan will result in more harms than benefits. My partner will be covering the case arguments and her 1NR after this speech. First, I want to note that the affirmative only answered our uniqueness and impact arguments. They did not answer the link or internal link arguments. Let me recap those quickly. A, link. Our Yeager and Hart 18 evidence says that regulations like the plan that are broad, vague, and difficult to enforce will greatly harm the agricultural sector by creating unnecessary and large costs. Landowners will simply stop farming and move to a different sector if the costs are too great. This will greatly decrease the amount of food produced, as well as completely undercutting the agricultural industry. B, internal link. Our Survey 21 evidence says that any harms to the agricultural sector ripple out to the broader economy. This is because many jobs such as transportation, restaurants, and machinery production depend on agriculture for their business. Without a strong agricultural sector, these other sectors will also crater. 40.7 million people, which is more than 1 out of every 4 workers, would be greatly affected by changes in the agricultural sector. If the agricultural sector were to collapse, so would the entire economy. At this point, we've established that passing the plan will tank the economy. All we need to do now is show how bad that harm would be. And to do so, we will answer the affirmative's uniqueness and impact arguments. A, uniqueness. There are some problems with the affirmative's uniqueness arguments. 1, their authors are only journalists. They are not reputable sources for explaining why the economy is in downturn or to what degree. They just report. They don't look any deeper. Our author is from the Federal Reserve, which is a much more trustworthy and credible authority, so you should prefer our evidence. 2, our evidence is specifically about the agricultural sector. Theirs is about the general economy. Our link and internal link are about how a hit to the agricultural sector would tank the whole economy, so their evidence doesn't really answer ours. 3, extend our 1 and C uniqueness evidence that specifically says that profits for agriculture are looking up in 2021 towards historic highs. This is really good evidence based on economic indicators from an excellent source. You can't really ask for anything better in a piece of evidence. B, impact. Once again, the affirmative argument is lacking on this point. 1, their evidence says that there have been 40 recessions and 20 wars. At minimum, this means that there is a 50% chance that a recession will cause a war. 2, the recession caused by the plan would be much worse than any other 40 recessions their evidence lists. Our link and internal link shows that agriculture is a key sector and that passing the plan would totally undercut it. 3, therefore, passing the plan will most certainly result in a war because the recession will be one of the worst ever, and the president will either start a war to jumpstart the manufacturing economy and reduce unemployment, or he might start a war as a diversion from the tanking economy. Either way, the probability is very high. 4, we have more evidence showing that we are in a unique position to have a war, that a war will happen now because of economic decline. Next, rising populism and nationalism from economic decline greatly increases the risk of war. That's Sundaram and Popov 19. As fears rise of yet another international financial crisis, there are growing concerns about the increased possibility of large-scale military conflict. Prolonged economic crisis combined with rising economic inequality, chauvinistic ethnopopulism, as well as aggressive jingoist rhetoric, including threats, could easily spin out of control and morph into military conflict, and worse, world war. Prolonged economic distress has worsened public apathy towards the culturally alien. Another round of economic stress is deemed likely to foment unrest, conflict, even rising economic insecurity, inequalities, and deprivation are expected to strengthen ethnopopulist and jingoist nationalist sentiments, and also increase social tensions and turmoil. Protracted economic distress, economic conflicts, or other financial crises could lead to military confrontation by the protagonists, even if unintended. Next, finally, it should be clear that passing the plan will result in an economic downturn and war that greatly outweighs the alleged benefits of passing the plan. I'm now open for cross-examination.
Nice. All right, Central, whenever you're ready.
Just a moment. Let me get the timer ready. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Why should we care about war impact?
We should care about a war impact because if we have tensions rising within our country and the economy, that could lead to war, which would lead to destruction of many things, and not only hurts people that are overseas, but also impacts people within like the United States as well. This could cause like a lot of like replicating things like the Great Depression. People are in poverty, and that is not a good thing.
So we just got out of the Afghanistan area and there from that 20-year-long war. How possible is it that Biden or whoever president you're referring to will go back into a war after that massive failure?
Well, our evidence doesn't necessarily suggest any specific examples of that. But our Sundaram and Popov 19 evidence talks about like how when we have like international financial crises and like there's still a lot of tensions that are going on in the Middle East, so we can't just act like it's like perfectly good now. We could still go back into a war. Different conflicts could arise with other countries in that region, but I don't specifically have a like sentence in my card that gives you probably the answer that you want.
Okay. You also mentioned how all of our, not all of our, but some of our authors are journalists. Are you suggesting that we shouldn't trust journalists?
I'm not saying that we shouldn't like not trust journalists and just throw out all of their credibility, because they still do have ethos in some capacity. But when we look at comparing our evidence, especially when we're talking about the economy, we should be preferring people who are economists and have a lot of experience within that region, know a lot about what they're talking about, rather than just people who are staff writers
Thanks.
at.
So can you explain the link between a loss in the agriculture sector and the general economy?
Yeah, I don't remember. Oh yeah, it was our Yeager and Hart 18 evidence that talks about how the agricultural sector is like directly like when the agricultural industry is impacted, that causes a ripple effect to the entire economy, because things like agriculture linked to like manufacturing, food production.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So we've seen an economic decline with COVID. Why haven't we entered a war like you suggest?
Well, we still are in like an economic decline. Our economy hasn't fully recovered from COVID like whatsoever. So to kind of like say that there is no risk of that happening is not necessarily true.
Cool, great questions. Going back to Farmington's main arguments, asking about them, asking some questions about how we might know if they're true or not. Really excellent cross-examination. Thank you, you two. So those are the 4 constructive speeches. Now we move into the second part of the debate, which is the rebuttal speeches. So we have 4 more speeches, and these are a lot shorter. The rebuttal speeches are a lot more focused on narrowing it down to a couple arguments, couple main arguments, and explaining to the judge why, if they vote for the other team, bad things will happen, and why, if you vote for, your team, good things will happen. So we're sort of switching modes here. We're switching from making more arguments and laying out the main arguments into a mode where we're thinking about what happens if the judge votes for us versus the other team. What are the main arguments for that outcome, and how can we explain to the judge that our plan is good and the other team's plan is bad? So 1NR from Farmington, whenever you're ready, we have 5 minutes for these rebuttals. Go ahead and take it away.
Okay. 1NR. For the second speech of the negative block, I will be focusing on case arguments since my partner just covered the economy disadvantage in the 2NC. Our point on this flow is that the plan doesn't really solve the problems it lays out. Therefore, if you vote for the plan at the end of this debate, it will cause more harms than benefits because it doesn't solve any problems, but it would still tank the economy. So going line by line of the debate, we can grant them the uniqueness, internal link, and impact on the case flow because in the end, they cannot solve the problem. So it doesn't matter if you pass a plan or not from this perspective. So for one, Extender Johnson evidence, it says that other forms of pollution other than agriculture are responsible for dead zones and biodiversity loss. The affirmative cannot solve these problems with their plan, so they cannot solve the problem at all. 2, even if agriculture is the main source of pollution, it doesn't matter. The affirmative says that the problem is bad now and will continue to risk if it gets worse. The affirmative cannot solve 100% of the problem, or if the affirmative cannot solve 100% of the problem, then they cannot solve 1% of the impact. Post-plan, this problem will continue to get worse, which leads to the impact. 3, the Shamra evidence from the 1NC completely decks the plan. The author is a PhD writing in an academic journal from last year, specifically about how the plan, like the affirmatives, would fail. It doesn't get much better than that for the evidence. Shamra says that farmers will only follow the law if they believe it is enforceable and that they will get fined. But non-point source pollution is extremely hard to enforce because it's almost impossible to know who is causing the pollution. The plan doesn't solve for this problem, and therefore they cannot solve the impacts they describe. Game over. The AF has 0 solvency. Number 4, they claim that their new piece of evidence from Matteo Sagasta answers this point, but it really doesn't. First, their evidence is from 2017 and ours is from 2020. So our evidence takes theirs into account. Second, their evidence simply says that using multiple approaches works better, not that it works well enough to solve the problem. 1% solvency is certainly better than 0, but it's still not much. Next, finally, number 5, when you add it all up, it is clear that the affirmative plan cannot solve the problem they describe in the 1AC. Therefore, when you vote at the end of this debate, you should see that the affirmative has much larger harms than they talk about, but they have 0% chance to solve them. Therefore, at minimum, we only need a 1% risk of the disadvantage happening in order for you to vote negative. I think my partner's speech was clear that the likelihood of this disadvantage leading to war is much greater and more harmful than any possibility that the affirmative solves an improbable biodiversity impact. And that's all for my 1NR.
Great, thank you, Farmington. So let's pause, take a quick time out here and recap what's going on in the debate. If any of you at your schools have questions, this is a good time to put them into the chat and we can answer them and see where everybody's at right now. So I'll give you some time to do that. And in the meantime, I'll talk about the big picture of the debate. So here we are at the end of the constructives. We have all the main arguments from both teams. There's not going to be any new arguments or evidence presented on either side because you don't really do that in the rebuttals. So everything we have in terms of arguments that we're going to work with is already here for us. So these last 3 speeches, the 1AR, the 2N, the first affirmative rebuttal, AKA the 1AR, the second negative rebuttal, and the second affirmative rebuttal, which are the final 3 speeches, are going to use what arguments we have already and explain why voting for their team is a better idea than voting for the other team. So how do we know which team is better to vote for? Both teams are going to give us a story about, if you vote for our team, this will happen. If you vote for the other team, this other thing will happen. And they're going to use the evidence and arguments that they've already put into the debate, entered into the debate, to explain how that happens. So right now, let's recap what those main arguments are. The affirmative's main arguments is that pollution in water is a really, really bad problem, and it's being caused primarily by agricultural runoff. So we need to pass a plan with some policies and regulation to stop that agricultural runoff from happening. Otherwise, it could harm biodiversity, maybe even lead to human extinction. Additionally, they also say that this whole economy thing, it's not really going to happen, right? There's not going to be any war if there's an economic downturn. And also the economy is already having some problems. So if it was true that economic downturn led to war, then it would have happened already, right? So that's the affirmative story. We need to solve this environmental stuff. Don't worry about the economy and this war stuff. It's not a big deal. So what's the negative story? The negative side story is that, sure, the environment might be in a bad place and there's some problems, but the affirmative plan, the regulations, don't solve those problems anyway. So there's no reason to pass the affirmative. Whatever laws they change, regulations they change, it's not going to be able to be enforced by the government, and also farmers won't pay attention to it, right? So if there's no possibility that the plan solves the problems with the environment, which team do we vote for? Well, the negative has a second argument, which is the economy disadvantage, right? And in the economy disadvantage, they say the economy is recovering and it's doing well right now, especially in agriculture. But if we pass this plan, it's going to put a bunch of regulations on farmers that's going to make it really, really hard for them to do their jobs. And most of them will either quit or become less productive and do a worse job. And if that happens, the impacts to the farming, the agriculture sector will ripple out to the economy, to things like, restaurants, grocery stores, manufacturing, transportation, all these things that depend on farming. And those will take a big hit too, which will really negatively impact the economy, which is bad in itself, but could potentially lead to a war if a president like Biden or somebody else wants to distract from the bad economy or wants to get manufacturing things restarted. They might just start a war to do those things. So the negative says, if you pass this plan, it not only won't solve the problem, but it'll create this other problem with the economy that might lead to war. So those are the 2 main stories that are going on in this debate. As we get into the last 3 speeches, try to follow those main stories and see what each team says about them using the evidence and using the arguments that they've brought up already. Zach at Thomas Edison asks, Jake, could you speak to the importance of dividing arguments between the 2NC and the 1NR? Yes, I can. So the last 2 speeches we heard, the first one from Farmington, last 2 speeches were both from Farmington. They're both on the negative side, right? So you might be asking yourself, why did we just hear 2 negative speeches in a row? That's because once we switch over to the rebuttals, we switch which team starts first. So affirmative got to go first for the constructives, and the negative gets to go first for the rebuttals. The affirmative has the advantage of going first and last in the debate, so the negative gets to do the 2 middle speeches. So the negative in the 2NC and the 1NR, those 2 speeches in the middle of the debate, those 2 partners basically get to split up who takes what arguments. So in this debate, the second negative constructive decide to talk about just the economy disadvantage. And she made a bunch of arguments explaining why the economy is going to have problems because of the plan and why that would be a big deal. And then you'll notice their partner from Farmington in the 1NR basically didn't talk about that at all, right? Their partner covered all that, they explained all that, and the affirmative didn't have a chance to respond. So there's no reason to follow up on it. So they went to a completely new topic. They went to the case arguments, and then they argued the case. And then at the end, they said a little bit about like, okay, this plus the economy thing together explains why you should vote negative. But they didn't go super in depth into both. So for your debates, you should try to do that same thing with your partner. In the 2NC and the 1NR, you should choose different arguments. But if you don't do that in your first few debates, that's okay. That's just something to work towards as you get some experience in these debates, right? Isaiah Wong asks, what are the time limits for cases, cross-ex, and rebuttals? So the constructives are the first 4 speeches in the debate. Each team gives 2 of them. For each speech, the time limit is 8 minutes. Cross-examination is 3 minutes long. And then the rebuttals, which are the last 4 speeches, 2 on each side in every debate, are 5 minutes long. Most judges are, a little flexible. If you go a couple seconds over to finish your sentence, that's okay. You don't have to stop exactly on time, but try to keep to the times. And if you have a phone or something with you, I highly recommend that you time yourself, because it's really hard for judges to be writing and listening to your arguments and also paying attention to the clock and letting you know how much time you have left. So don't be surprised by the timer. Keep your own timer. Make sure you have your time going on. I think it is time to move on to the 1AR here. So Central, ready for a little 1AR?
A little 1AR action? I think I am. Okay. Alrighty. Starting in 3, 2, 1. For the first affirmative rebuttal, I will be starting on case arguments, then moving on to the economy disadvantage. Our argument is that the plan will solve all of the extreme dangers we have listed, and that there are no risks to the disadvantage. So you vote on solving water pollution with the plan. Start with the uniqueness on case. 1. Uniqueness. Extend our Smith 2019 evidence, which states that agriculture is the largest cause of water pollution in the United States. Meaning if we solve for agricultural damages to water, we solve for water pollution. 2, onto internal link. Extend our Boehm 2020 card as well as our Steele and Schultz 2015 cards, which demonstrate how pollution leads to a loss in biodiversity, destroying fishery and oceanic environments. Next, 3, impact. Extend our Schultz 2016 card, which states that the pollution will eventually take out a key species, causing a completely destroyed biosphere, leading to the loss of hundreds of animal species and extinction for humans. This whole argument was completely unanswered by the negative, meaning you must assume it to be true. Therefore, if you believe that our plan will help solve water pollution, which I'm about to explain, you vote on preventing destroyed environments and preventing human extinction. So moving on to solvency. 1, extend Brigham and Myers 2014, as well as Finney 2021, which both explain that federal subsidies, increased regulation, and transparency will solve. The negative stated that their Sharma card outweighs because their evidence focuses solely on identifying however, their evidence focuses solely on identifying pollution from non-point sources and the difficulties in assigning blame to this. However, this ignores the things that farmers have to gain from the plan, like federal subsidies, as well as transparency leading to industry innovation. There is no way to know how difficult locating non-point sources will be without at least trying the plan, as previously stated. There's also no harm in trying. Also, defer to our evidence as Brigham and Myers are researchers at the Harvard Environmental Law Review. Well, their only author credibility was that their author had a PhD, but it doesn't specify in what, so it could be in literature, which is irrelevant to the study that they are discussing. Next, moving on to the economy disadvantage. I will now be explaining how there are no real risks to the economy disadvantage. So, first, starting on link and internal link. The economy is already severely damaged right now and is only getting worse. They also agreed to this during Cross-Ex. This means that being a landowner is not even profitable right now, and we are seeing no ripple-out damages that are leading to a war. Next, moving on to uniqueness. Extend TAP 21 and UDLN 21, which explain that the economy is heading down right now. They argued that their evidence was more credible due to the author, but beyond our evidence, it is also common knowledge that unemployment has massively increased and the economy has been severely damaged by COVID. And they themselves agreed to this during Cross-X. You do not need an economist to know this. They also said that their evidence is better because they state that damaging agriculture would tank the whole economy. But our evidence clearly states that the whole economy is already tanked. Next, moving on to impact. There is no evidence that recessions lead to war. They were unable to explain during Cross-X why we didn't see a war from the COVID-19 economic recession, which was one of the largest in history. We have had a massive economic recession in 2008, and there was also no war caused by that. Those are the two most recent empirical examples, and no wars came from it. Just because there have been wars and there have been recessions, it does not mean that one is caused by the other. Extend our WOLT 20 card, which explains this. In conclusion, the impacts of their DA do not outweigh the benefits of the plan. We will not see a war coming from non-existent damages to an already destroyed economy. But if we pass the plan, we will save ourselves from extinction and the destruction of our biosphere. That is the end of my speech.
Nice. So yeah, that's the 1AR. Now we're going to get into the 2NR and the 2AR, which are the final two speeches for each team in the debate. So it's really, really important in these speeches that they give a clear idea of, okay, if you vote for us, this is going to happen and here's why. If you vote for the other team, this is going to happen and here's why. And therefore, because our world is better, you should vote for us. As judges, you should always pay attention to every speech, but you should definitely pay attention to these last two speeches because they're going to really clearly articulate what their different worlds look like. And after this debate, I'm of course going to give my view on what happened in the debate. But before that, I'm going to give you some time with your teams and your coaches and your partners to talk about who you think won the debate and why, based on what evidence and arguments were presented. So if you've given up flowing, if your flow doesn't look very good, if your notes don't look great, this is a good time to start again. Try to take notes on these last two speeches and try to get a really good idea of what's going on in this debate. Okay, Farmington, are we ready for the last negative rebuttal?
I think I'm ready. Okay. All right. Okay, so in my second negative rebuttal, I will be outlining the main reasons why voting for the affirmative plan is a bad idea. First, I will be addressing the economy disadvantage and why the risks of the impacts of the disadvantage outweigh. Next, I will be addressing case and why the affirmative's unclear solvency is a reason to vote neg instead. First, on to the economy disadvantage. 1. In the 1AR, the AF said that the economy is already declining now. Even if this were true, this statement by the AF jumpstarts the link of the disadvantage. In the 2NC point B sub point 4, we stated that economic decline already sets us up in a unique position that is just begging for a war to happen. A, our Kaufman and Creatman evidence that went unanswered from the 1NC and was extended in the 2NC states that even if what the AF is saying about the economy is true, the ag industry is still just doing fine. But the plan would put the ag sector in critical condition. B, our Sundaram and Popov evidence was completely unanswered by the AF as well in the 1AR, which means that our evidence must be true. This card uses the 2008 housing crisis as an example where our international relations were holding on by a thread. Military conflict with other countries would lead to a world war. This would be extremely destructive, and the time frame is faster than loss of biodiversity. C, the AF stated that the affirmative plan will not lead to war because empirically the 2008 recession proves. Again, this is not true because the recession dealt with other things like real estate while COVID put the whole entire economy on pause. The effects are not over, and although the economy is starting to recover, the affirmative plan will push it off its tipping point and bring us back to square one and even back past square one. D, their own evidence states that there have been 40 recessions and 20 wars. That means that there is at least a 40% risk or probability of a recession leading to war. That is way too big of a risk for us to take. Second, on to case. The AF claims that agriculture is the biggest cause of water pollution and that the pollution will lead to biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss leads to human extinction. 1, they go on to say that solving agricultural pollution solves all water quality, or at least a significant amount, but this is not only a stretch, but it's just not simply true. Our Johnson 15 evidence used within the debate states that there are too many other factors that can play into water pollution. Johnson is a water quality specialist, which has more credibility than an economic analyst. Factors like sewage waste and daily household use come into play, which also play factors in that pollution. 2, our Yeager and Hart 18 evidence that says that with regulation, when costs get too high and the profit doesn't match up, these industries are going to move to different industries, which could possibly be industries that cause the same issues of water pollution, but just in a different sector. And there's no answer to this from the AF, so we can't really prove if they're actually going to solve for what they claim for. Thus, my partner Elena and I have proven throughout this debate that the harms and the uncertainty of the AF outweigh. My partner Elena set this up really well in the 1NR. The AF may say that they have large harms, which is true, extinction is a huge issue, but they can't even solve for their own harms. There are way too many other factors that come into play, and there's too many questions that cannot be answered by the AF. We only need a 1% risk of the disadvantaged link for you to vote negative. With the evidence from the AF, they state that a recession which would be caused by the AF would only need a 40% chance. Again, 40% is more than enough. The likelihood of the disadvantage happening and destructive war occurring is much more harmful and larger than the 1% risk that the AF solves for extinction.
Great. So there you have it, the 2NR. That's the negatives, basic main argument for what's going to happen if you vote affirmative in this debate and why you should vote negative, right? So we're talking about plan doesn't solve the problem they think they solve. And if you do pass the plan, it's going to cause this huge economic problem that could lead to a war. So depending on how you feel about that, you might think that's a pretty strong argument at this point and that the affirmative is in a pretty bad position, that they have to answer this. Or you might think that maybe that's not such a strong argument and you think this is going to be pretty easy for the affirmative to answer it. But we don't know until we get there, right? So we have our last speech of the debate, the second affirmative rebuttal, where the team from Central on the affirmative gets to make their final case, their final plea to the judge to explain why voting for the affirmative team to pass these laws, these regulations on agriculture is in fact a good idea and will solve more problems than it creates. So, Central, whenever you're ready.
All right, I'll set up my timer and then I'm good to go. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. For the second and final affirmative rebuttal, I will be starting on case arguments, then moving up to the economy disadvantage. Our argument is that the plan will solve all of the extreme dangers we have listed and proven, and then there are no risks to the disadvantage. So you vote on solving water pollution with the plan. I will prove that the economic decline will not cause war, and it will not happen because of the plan, and that the plan solves all the harms brought. Starting with on case. 1, uniqueness. Extend our Smith 2019 evidence, which states that agriculture is the largest cause of water pollution in the United States, meaning if we solve for agriculture damage, we solve for water pollution. They state that agriculture isn't the only cause, but it is the largest cause. So we should focus on this so we can solve the largest problem currently. 2, internal links. Extend our Boehm 2020 and Steele and Schultz 2015 cards, which demonstrate how pollution leads to a loss in biodiversity, destroying fisheries and oceanic environments. These are huge because we don't know where the line is that we haven't crossed yet that will lead to extinction. This should be weighed above all else because extinction is a very, very large impact. Next. Impact, extend our Schultz 2016 cards, which states that pollution will eventually take out a key species, causing a completely destroyed biosphere, leading to the loss of hundreds of animal species and extinction for humans. This whole argument was unanswered by the neg, meaning you should assume it to be true. Therefore, you should believe that our plan will help solve water pollution, and your vote on preventing destroyed environments and preventing extinction. Moving on to solvency, extend Brigham and Myers 2014 as well as Finney 2021, which both explain that federal subsidies, increased regulations, and transparency will solve. These are in our plan, so our plan will solve. The neg says Sharma outweighs, but their evidence focuses solely on identifying pollution from non-point sources and the difficulty in assigning blame and thus negative consequences. However, this ignores the things farmers have to gain from federal subsidies and industry innovation. Again, our evidence proves. There is also no way to know how difficult locating non-point sources are without at least trying with the plan. There's no harm in trying. Defer to our evidence as Brigham and Myers, as my partner proved during the 1AR. Now moving on to the economy disadvantage, I will be explaining that there are no real risks to the economy disadvantage. One, Lincoln Internal. The economy is already severely damaged right now and is only getting worse, meaning that being a landowner is not profitable right now, and we are seeing no ripple damages leading to war. They say we conceded on the link because the plan and economy declined, but which we did not, but we also proved that there is no risk or impact to the DA. Next, onto uniqueness. First and foremost, during Cross-X, they agreed with our COVID uniqueness that there is an economic decline right now. They said we haven't crossed over a threshold, which they did not explain, nor is backed by any evidence. So therefore, you should defer to our points. Extend tab 21 and Ungland 21, which explain that the economy is heading down right now. They argued that their evidence was more credible due to the author, but beyond our evidence, it is also common knowledge that unemployment had massively increased and the economy had been severely damaged by COVID. You do not need an economist to know that. By attacking our journalists, they also
asking the
they also said that their evidence is better because they state that damaging agriculture would tank the whole economy, but our evidence clearly states that the whole economy is already tanked. There is no impact directly from the plan. Impact, there is no evidence that recessions lead to war. They could not explain why our multiple recessions have not caused more wars than we've participated in. This is correlation, not causation. Extend our Walt 20 card, which explains this. They're sad about 40% and the 40 recessions to 20 wars is not accurate considering the data going into it, as well as it's not a logical point that's backed by evidence and shouldn't be considered or flowed in this debate. In conclusion, we have proven that pollution is bad right now in our waters and that the plan is the best way to go about solving this. We have also proven the impacts of the DA do not outweigh the impacts of our harms without the plan, and we do not link to it based on uniqueness. Vote affirmative because we have unequivocally proven our points against the evidence and arguments brought by the negative. End speech.
Great, thank you, Maren. That is the end of our debate here. So don't leave. I want to be in here for a second. I want you to, well, first of all, thank our debaters. Toss something in the chat, say, thanks debaters, great job. They did a really great job showing the main parts of these arguments, what's happening in the rookie packet, and setting out a great example of what really good in-depth debating will look like. If your debates don't look like this, if they're not this technical, they're not this focused on the evidence, they're not this smooth and polished in terms of how they're speaking, don't worry about it. The debaters in this debate have been debating for a long time. They're really great. They're just here to show you an example, something to work towards, not something that we expect on day one. And by the way, in your debates, you're going to be debating in front of 1 or 2 people, not in front of a big group like this. So don't worry about it. Okay, so here's what I want from you all on your teams there. If you're physically together or if you have a separate room open in Zoom or something, this is a good, or if you're just alone, that's fine too. This is a good time to think about the following question. Which team would you vote for at the end of this debate? If you vote for the affirmative team, what happens to agricultural pollution. Does it solve the problem? Does it not solve the problem? How much and why should we care? And if you vote for the affirmative team to pass these laws, how does that affect the economy? Does it hurt the economy? Does it make it worse than it is right now? Does that potentially lead to something worse happening like a war or an economic recession? Or is it just kind of a minor thing that's not really important? And if you vote for the negative team, what happens with all that pollution? Is it not really a big deal? Or is it just something that doesn't matter either way? Because if the plan doesn't solve it, then it doesn't matter at all. And if you vote for the negative, what does that mean for the economy? Does the economy keep growing and recover and we have some of these problems solved? Or does the economy keep going down anyway? So it doesn't matter if we pass this plan or not. Something to speak about with your teams for a second. I'll give you a couple minutes before I give my opinion on the debate. And that way you all can have some time to talk together. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick decision like a judge would give it so that you all can see what it looks like when your judge gives you feedback. Hopefully, as you talked with your teams or you thought about which team you thought won, you had specific reasons for thinking why that team won, and you were able to compare teams and say which one did a better job and which one had a more important outcome. As a judge, you want to focus on the debate, you want to focus on the arguments and focus on the evidence. That's what's really important. So for example, if I was being a bad judge, I might say something like, okay, I vote affirmative because I think Caden has the best fit. They have the most drip in the debate. So they're the coolest debater. I vote affirmative. That's a really bad decision as a judge, right? You want to be able to say, I vote for this team because if I vote for them, these outcomes would happen, and those are better than the outcomes of voting for the other team. So hopefully that's what your decisions will sound like today in your debate that you do after this, if you choose to do it. And that's what we're shooting for here for you all in your decisions also. So if I were the judge and I were making a decision in this debate, I think I would vote affirmative. And the reason I would vote for the affirmative team is because of the stories of the two worlds, the affirmative and the negative. If I vote affirmative, I have some chance to stop biodiversity loss and environmental destruction, which could potentially lead to extinction of whole ecosystems and of the human species. Additionally, I think the affirmative did a really good job answering the story of the economy disadvantage by saying that the economy has already been going down recently because of COVID and the housing crisis of 2008, and there weren't any wars caused by that. So just because there's a correlation between the amount of recessions and wars does not mean there's a causation. So even if I vote affirmative and there is this economic recession, that's of course bad, but it probably won't lead to like war or anything really, really bad. So when we're thinking about, you know, if I vote affirmative, I may not fully solve the problem of pollution, but I can at least decrease it or make it take longer to have any actual consequences, big consequences. And I don't think that it's likely to cause a really big war or anything super bad. So solving for pollution seems like it's more important than taking the risk of maybe harming the economy and leading to something bad. So that's what my decision as a judge might sound like. If yours sounded like that, if you voted for affirmative for same reasons, that's great, awesome, good job judging and evaluating the debate. If you voted for the negative, that's also fine too. Reasonable people can look at these arguments and disagree about which team won. I think both teams did a really great job. It was a really even debate, and you could vote for either team based on the arguments made, regardless of you know, which side you think is stronger. So I hope that helps in terms of what that should look like and sound like. And hopefully your judges will say something similar in your equally excellent debates. A big thank you for being here to everyone, and especially to our demo debaters. And that's all I have for you. See ya. Thanks for being here, everyone.